Right, well, good evening and welcome to the Mile End Institute. It's very good to have you here this evening, especially on such a wet and miserable day, and when there are one or two other things going on in the news. When we planned this event, obviously we had no idea that it would be in the first week of a general election campaign. But of course, if there is one issue that we should be talking about in a general election, it is the question of climate change. If we don't address this question, national service and VAT on private school fees is going to seem rather small beer. The starting point for this event is that climate change is the great policy challenge of our time. It's a challenge for government, it's a challenge for international institutions, and it's a challenge for us as citizens. And it's a question that affects almost every area of public policy. It's about economic policy. It's about security strategy, health policy and transport, defence and international relations. And it's going to ask all sorts of new questions of political traditions that were designed with very different questions and problems in mind. So tonight is a chance to think about conservatism and the climate crisis. So we'll be exploring its record in government, the challenges that it might face in the future, and what environmentalists might want to draw from the conservative tradition. And we're joined this evening by three panellists who are very well qualified to help us think about that. So to my immediate left, Sam Hall is the director of the Conservative Environment Network, which I think is the largest single parliamentary caucus. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent, it is now. Brings together more than 150 MPs and peers, and also very large numbers of local councillors. And if you visit their website, you'll find a lot of really interesting and helpful resources and policy papers around the kind of themes we'll be exploring tonight. Rachel Coxcoon is the founder and director of ClimateGuide, which works particularly to support local government in the transition to a net zero future. She's currently writing a PhD at Lancaster University, which explores how voters engage with questions like net zero. And I think she'll be sharing some of her work this evening on rural voters. I should say as a kind of trigger warning that Rachel was previously a Liberal Democrat councillor. She was the cabinet member for climate policy, but she's speaking to us this evening in her academic capacity. And then Pilita Clark is an associate editor at the Financial Times, but was previously their environment correspondent. She's written extensively about environmental questions and climate policy, and I believe she is the only person to have been named Environment Journalist of the Year 3 times in a row. So each of our panellists will make some opening remarks. I might also say something about Margaret Thatcher. We'll then have a bit of an open discussion, and then we will open it up to hear your comments and questions too. But can we begin, please, by welcoming our panellists? Sam, do you want to kick off?
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join this event today and to join such a distinguished panel of other speakers. As Rob's already said, my name's Sam Hall. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservative Environment Network. And before talking about some of the conservative insights which I think Conservatives can bring to the environmental policy debates, I thought I'd set out a little bit about the work of CEN, first of all, and the sorts of things that we do within our organisation. So our mission is to promote environmental issues, environmental policies from within the Conservative tradition. We're independent of the Conservative Party, but we work very closely with Conservative politicians at all different levels of government and advocate policies from within the Conservative standpoint. So as part of this mission, we draw very much on some of the great Conservative thinkers and politicians who've written and championed environmental issues, from Edmund Burke, who's sort of thought of as the grandfather of conservative philosophy, who wrote about the intergenerational responsibility that we have the intergenerational contract, of which the environment, I think, is one of the most obvious examples of how we have to hand on to the next generation what we have inherited, protected and enhanced. Philosophers like Roger Scruton, who wrote about the instinct that Conservatives have to care for their home, the love of home, he called it oikophilia. Conservative leaders like Margaret Thatcher, who was the first world leader to warn about climate change at the United Nations back in 1989, and maybe we'll hear a bit more about her later on. And more recent Conservative leaders as well, people like David Cameron, who obviously really emphasised the environment as part of his modernisation agenda. So with our network, as Rob's already mentioned, we have around 120 MPs, about 20 or so members of the House of Lords. We've got a group as well in the Scottish Parliament of Scottish MSPs. We've got about 1,000 grassroots supporters and around 500 councillors from across the UK, all of whom sign up to a set of environmental principles. And we work with them on individual campaigns. Not every campaign that we advocate as SEN, they will all necessarily endorse, but we work with them as coalitions of the willing. And we have focus on a range of environmental issues. So I know tonight we're specifically focused on climate change and the climate crisis, but we also work on nature, restoration and the biodiversity crisis, and resource security as well. And we work through campaigning, through providing a platform to positive and trusted Conservative voices who are, I think, well placed to influence other Conservatives on environmental matters, perhaps better than traditional environmental NGOs can do. We convene the debate so Conservatives can feel more comfortable talking in a trusted setting with other Conservatives about green issues, and we try and make distinctly Conservative arguments in support of environmental policies. And we've worked on a range of policy campaigns, some of which have ended up in government policy, from things like the phasing out of coal-fired power stations to the enshrining in legislation of net zero itself and a target to halt biodiversity loss by 2030. We've called for the elimination of VAT on energy efficiency products successfully, and called for the uncapping of fines of water companies that illegally pollute our rivers, and called for that money to be reinvested in a water restoration fund. So we've had some success working with our network on specific policies. Briefly, just to talk about some of the things that I think Conservatives can bring to the environmental policy debates and our approach at SEN. So for us, we don't think the environmental debate should be about whether to tackle climate change or biodiversity loss or sort of dispute the existence or the severity of these crises, but to talk instead about how best to do it. And we think we Conservatives need to bring Conservative insights about policy making to that debate in order to show how best we should try and hit our environmental targets. So I think one obvious place to start on that is around the role of the private sector and markets. Obviously this is a kind of mainstay of Conservative economic thinking, that the private sector, forces like competition, free trade can help reduce costs for consumers and for the taxpayer, and we think that can be applied very well to the environmental transition. So one example that I would mention is our approach to subsidising renewable energy. Under the Labour government, they had this system of renewable obligation certificates, which is essentially a flat subsidy that all renewables got. Under the coalition government, Conservative-led government, and then subsequently being continued under Conservative majority governments, that shifted to an auction where the government buys renewable capacity through a competitive market process. I think that can be a very effective way to keep down costs for consumers through applying those insights around markets. And indeed, that whole transition has been financed through private capital rather than through borrowing from the taxpayer. Another area that I think the Conservatives have been able to bring a specific insight is around Brexit and using some of our regulatory autonomy that we've gained from being outside the EU. The common agricultural policy, I think even the biggest supporters of the EU from within the environmental community would recognise that the common agricultural policy, as well as being a wasteful and inefficient form of subsidising farming, is also been environmentally damaging and has encouraged farmers to scrub up hedgerows and other bits of natural habitat in order to maximise the amount of subsidy they could get for keeping land in an agricultural condition. Outside of the EU, the UK has been able to roll out a new system of agricultural support, rewarding farmers farmers instead for delivering nature-friendly farming techniques, so things like growing cover crops or planting more hedgerows, for example, or using fertiliser in a more efficient way to reduce water pollution. All these things are also good for food security, because we know that healthy soils, pollinators, clean and abundant water are all necessary for the farming sector to continue to produce food long into the future, but they're also critical for the environment. And I think Conservatives have shown a desire to take advantage of those Brexit freedoms in how they've approached agricultural subsidy. I think there are a couple of areas where, in my view, the Conservatives haven't done as much as they could have done in terms of applying Conservative insights. One is around, getting the state out of the way to help technologies that are cost competitive compete more fairly. An obvious one would be onshore wind. There are unique planning barriers in the system at the moment that prevent the building of onshore wind. I think a Conservative, more free market approach would be to liberalise that system, allow those technologies to come to market faster. Another area would be around innovation in the food space, allowing cultured meat, for example, to access market faster, which could enable lower emission, more environmentally friendly forms of food to feed the nation. Another area that I don't think the Conservatives have done as much on but could do, that is a very Conservative approach, is the kind of really localist and volunteer-led approach. So Edmund Burke wrote about little platoons, these sort of groups of local communities coming together to solve problems. I think taking that sort of approach, for example, on biodiversity loss, planting woodlands, restoring our rivers. I thought it was quite striking in the National Service announcement that came out over the weekend. Environmental volunteering wasn't mentioned, and I think that was a missed opportunity. I think the other final point, which I'll conclude on, which I think is a very Conservative approach, but I think is shared across the political spectrum, is around the role of growth, technology and innovation. And I think, looking at what the Conservatives have done on support for nuclear fusion, small modular nuclear reactors, these sort of next generation of nuclear technologies, support for carbon capture storage technology around clusters, around some of our big industrial heartlands, support for decarbonising aviation through technologies like hydrogen or through sustainable aviation fuel. Bringing the sort of technology and innovation to bear on tackling our environmental problems can help us avoid having to force uncomfortable lifestyle choices on people against their will, and also enable us to continue growing the economy, supporting industry and business at the same time. So I know there's lots more to talk about on the kind of government records, on some of the challenges that I think Conservative environmentalists might have after the election, and very happy to answer any questions on that in the Q&A session.
Thank you.
I think we'll stand up, otherwise I'll have to keep craning my neck. Oh, I made it make a noise.
That was impressive.
What do I do? Oh, there you go. It wasn't as hard as it looked. And I told you that lectern would be too high for me. Right, I have real lectern anxiety because I'm not 5 feet. Right, so I'm just actually going to introduce you a bit to the research that I'm doing, because I hope that sets the scene a little bit for some of the issues around conservatism and links with rurality that I think will be really important moving climate policy forward. So just to put it in context, I'm part of a group at Lancaster University called Climate Citizens, which is led by Professor Becky Willis, who was one of the people responsible for setting up the Climate Assembly UK a couple of years ago, which ended up happening during COVID. And the idea is really to, the wider project that all the PhDs and postdocs are part of is thinking about how we best involve people in making policy rather than doing policy to people. And then the title of my own PhD is specifically around how can science-based policy making on climate be made more inclusive of the opinions and concerns of rural English residents with right-of-centre worldviews. And I think I became really interested in this because, as was mentioned, I was a local politician. I was cabinet member for climate change at Cotswold District Council for 4 years before moving away, and I now live in Herefordshire, which is even more rural. And I feel that there's a sort of a divide really often between the sort of, in a way we saw it play out with Brexit, where people were talking about the metropolitan elites and then the sort of maybe more left behind places where they were talking about more industrial places, but they were also talking about the maybe ignored parts of the rural parts of Britain as well. And I think from a climate policy point of view, this is really important. So I just want to introduce you to some maps. These are a few years old now. These are from 2022 because they're from when I was putting together my PhD application. But I kind of wanted to illustrate the fact that the vast majority of the land area in this country is under the control, or was at least at that time, of the Conservative Party, either at local government level or because the parliamentary constituencies in the rural areas were overwhelmingly held by Conservative MPs at this time in mid-2022. So the map on the left is your district council network. The next pale blue map is the overlay of the old counties on top of that, so where we've got the two-tier areas like Gloucestershire and so on. So you can see that at that time, the vast majority of the county councils were Conservative controlled. A huge proportion of the district councils also Conservative controlled, and a very, very large number of the rural parliamentary constituencies. So it means that something like 80% of the land area, which is occupied by only about 17% of the population, is under the control of, or is kind of, in a way, it's a culturally conservative place. People tend to vote for Conservative politicians there, and I think that tells us something about what they believe and how they feel that the world should be run, as it were. And then that kind of weirdly bloated map on the right is by population. So if you stretch out all the constituencies, you can see that those little red splodges, which are the kind of the sprawling metropolitan boroughs of the north and London and so on like that, are actually much bigger places in terms of people. But I think what my PhD is interested in is thinking about this disconnect between rural and urban places and how badly thought through or badly consulted on climate policy could really backfire. And particularly in the context of us now going into a GE, I would want to be kind of confident that the kind of Conservatives moving forward would be able to put this voice forward, this rural voice that might continue to be overlooked. And that's essentially that in rural areas, people have innately high carbon lifestyles. You can't get a bus, you can't cycle. There is none of this provision of the public transport and everything that you need, principally because it's not logistically possible in many places to achieve that in places like the Cotswolds, not because people don't want to try. So they see these rollouts of amazing electric buses in Bristol and in Manchester and all of these things. They know it's not coming their way. They see all these rollouts of retrofit for flats and houses and so on in Brighton and wherever, and they know it's not coming their way. And then they're simultaneously said, can you have all the wind turbines? Can you host all this infrastructure that will benefit the rest of the population, largely in urban areas, and you will kind of not really get anything from it? And I don't really have an issue with there being a more transactional relationship and a much more open conversation about the burden and benefit in terms of how policy, the physical policy, where the national scale solutions to climate change actually play out. I think that something I'm looking at as well is that there are emotional and national identity attachments to the land. And as we change the landscape, either through changed agricultural practices, because we're going to be changing the way we generate energy to a much more decentralized system and so on, that could actually that's more meaningful on a very deep level, potentially to people who live in the countryside for whom they feel that is their landscape. And this idea as well that I've seen, and I think I've seen this even more since going into academia, is that the climate change kind of narrative on the left I have seen over the last 15 years or so creeping further away from the more tangible green things, many of which Sam just touched on around biodiversity, all of which are important, and becoming more and more abstract and more framed in social justice terms, and terms that can be quite jarring and difficult, I think, for a socially conservative person to necessarily wrap their brain around. And so just to give you a sort of insight into what I'm looking at, I've recently closed a large survey, which was only put out in rural areas. People were asked to give me their political identity by telling me which party they felt they were generally aligned with, not who do you vote for, so that I wouldn't get tactical voting in there, and to put themselves on a left to right scale from 1 to 10. And then I've sort of developed a scale, and I just wanted to give you, I haven't done the full work and exploratory factor analysis or anything like that, but to give you some emerging findings on where I'm seeing these kind of cultural differences. Some of these items around attachment to countryside that I think will be very important in terms of energy infrastructure rollout. The English countryside is beautiful to me largely because it's been shaped by many generations of my country people. This is very much the Burkean ideal of, that kind of what we owe to the dead and we steward for the future and so on. We can see that the strongly agree is heavily stacked up in the Conservative and also Reform UK end of that response. It doesn't matter to me what the English countryside looks like as long as I know the changes we're making are directly contributing to tackling climate change. Again, we can see that quite strong resistance to that on the political right, and I think that's important because I think these are suggestive of a latent a latent trait here that's about an emotional attachment to the countryside. And here, this is maybe something around practice. Some of the items are around agricultural practices. Reducing meat in our diets would be a good thing for the country because it will allow us to rewild and reforest large areas of England's countryside. You know, this kind of assumption that people are real keen to have everything reforested and change agricultural practices. Again, there's quite a distinct political split. And some of these things will be policy formulations if there is a Labour government, almost unthinkingly. And I think that they could lead to quite an emotional backlash, and we need to be very careful of that. And the last thing is really that I've also been looking at how policy gets made. And you will have all seen things like climate assemblies, citizens' assemblies, things like that spoken about. I have my suspicions that they may not be as appealing to people on the right as on the left. And I've been looking into that. And certainly I've got a paper in review at the moment that shows that the Herefordshire Assembly, despite having gone to great lengths to find young and old and rich and poor and a mix of ethnic minorities and every other socio-demographic mix you could find in the room, they didn't ask about politics. And when you look at the split, there were far fewer Conservatives there than you would expect in such a Conservative place. And that seems to be playing out in other assemblies. So how do Conservatives want policy to be made, and what does local democracy feel like to them in terms of climate policy making, I think will be important going forward. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to stand up as well. Otherwise, I'll look lazy or something. Well, thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm just going to talk about two changes that I've seen since I was first appointed environment correspondent at the Financial Times in 2011. Two changes in the way the Conservative Party has approached climate change. The first one is by far the most important, and it is one that I really did not expect to see. It is the slip towards partisanship that happened towards the end of last year, in September last year, when Rishi Sunak made a speech about a new approach to net zero after the Conservatives narrowly clung on in the Uxbridge by-election in July. And I'm sure most people in the room remember that speech because the Prime Minister said that although the Conservatives still believed very much in net zero and had no intention of moving away from their international commitments on net zero, there needed to be a new approach to take into account the costs and the burdens that were going to fall. And so we saw this shift away from the 2035 targets for being able to buy an electric car. We saw a shift to slowing or easing of the plans for shifting away from gas boilers, scrapping of plans for energy efficiency and rental properties and so forth. And the interesting thing about that was, you might just be able to faintly detect that I wasn't brought up in this country. I'm originally from Australia, and it was really jarring to me to hear a British Conservative leader talk about climate policy in this way, because I'm very accustomed, having lived many years in Australia and also spent quite a bit of time working in the United States, a little bit of time in Canada as well, big fossil fuel producing and exporting countries where the climate change debate really is very volatile. And Conservative parties, centre-right parties are much more inclined than they are in this country to adhere to policies that are not necessarily extremely strongly pro-climate. So hearing that speech last year was just a jolt, because for all of the time that I had been covering climate change and environmental issues in this country, there had been this extraordinary level of bipartisanship. To the point that in 2015, I don't know if you remember, ahead of that election, there was a tripartite pledge between the Conservatives, Labor and the Lib Dems, where they all agreed that no matter who won, they were going to continue to try to make sure that carbon budgets were met, push for a really strong legally binding agreement that year that in fact did end up occurring in Paris. And generally make sure that there was an agreement on a push to a low carbon economy and indeed the phase out of unabated coal power. So it was extremely interesting, I guess, to then, having had pretty much a front row seat to some of the policies that were introduced under the coalition government from 2010, and then once the Conservatives were governing in their own right from 2015. You know, some really quite extraordinary policies. It was always great for me to be able to go back to Australia or whenever I was in the US and say, look, you know, the party of Margaret Thatcher is phasing out coal-fired power. It is going, it eventually would come to legislate for net zero. It's got some of the world's most ambitious climate targets, 68% cut in emissions by 2030. It's boosted renewables to an extraordinary extent, actually. And it's introduced something called a Green Investment Bank, which at the time was, again, world leading, really quite an ambitious sort of a policy. It's basically, it tried to do things like a home insulation scheme with the, I don't know if anybody remembers the Green Deal scheme. Unfortunately, it wasn't as successful as it might have been. It didn't succeed on everything. It ended up selling off the Green Investment Bank to my fellow country persons in Australia at Macquarie Bank. Onshore wind farms were very difficult. Zero carbon homes were unfortunately not what they were expected to be. However, it did turn the UK into literally at one point, and news editors always used to ask me about this, I would say, you know, it was the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. At one point, the United Kingdom had more offshore wind power capacity than the rest of the world combined. And in fact, that was the case until fairly recently. So it was really quite a jolt to see this shift away from bipartisanship. In fact, from bipartisanship, I've just actually filed a column this evening, which is looking at what Chris Skidmore and the Conservative minister said recently at a climate conference here in London, where he was asked, you know, if you really believe in climate change, should you vote Conservative? And he said, well, no, he didn't think so, which was, you know, really not something I would have predicted. Just finally, very quickly, the second thing, from a journalist perspective, another big shift that has occurred is that when it comes to covering climate change, I now realise that when I began in 2011, it was a golden era for doing this. And I don't really know if it was because it was a coalition and the Lib Dems were pushing it. I actually think a lot of Conservative ministers were pushing this as well. But basically, every other week, certainly every month, you would think nothing of being called in to see ministers and officials in what was then the Department of Energy and Climate Change, DEFRA, the Environment Department, to be briefed in detail on everything from badger culling to electricity market reform, to smart meters, COP climate talks, anything and everything. A huge amount of, I realise now, openness. For some reason that I would say started to fade maybe towards 2016, I'm not sure exactly when, but then certainly more recently, we've seen almost, I mean, it's not just me, it's also my colleagues who cover clean energy and infrastructure and aviation even, all sorts of policy areas. Very few briefings, communication with departments by email, sometimes by Zoom. It just makes it very difficult to explain what's happening and to talk about what the government has been doing and what the Conservatives think about climate change when you're not having that sort of upfront, close and personal contact. So that's been another shift, but I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel speak about other aspects of the Conservatives and climate change now. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you. So I am the only person on this panel who is not an expert on the environment or the climate, but I am a historian, and in particular a historian of Margaret Thatcher. And I think Margaret Thatcher actually makes a really interesting case study in the history of conservative environmentalism that perhaps helps us pull out some of the issues that we're thinking about this evening. So, the 1980s was a really important moment for environmental policy. It was a time when new issues were pushing up the political agenda. People may remember things like acid rain or the hole in the ozone layer. Even terms like global warming was starting to be talked about in mainstream politics. And those questions were posing quite new kinds of dilemmas. Because environmental policy itself clearly was not new. But the environmental questions of the 1950s and the 1960s tended to be questions like smog in London, or pollution in rivers, or protecting national parks. And crucially, those were questions that you could resolve through domestic political action. But acid rain was about pollution in one country, destroying forests in another. The ozone layer definitionally was a planetary question. So the environment was starting to become a dilemma for international politics and not just for nation states. That's one shift. A second is that this was a decade when public pressure on policy making was becoming difficult to ignore. The rise of the Green Party, famously winning 2 million votes in 1989, the huge expansion of movements like Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace, even the world's first eco-superhero in 1990 arrived on television screens in the much-lamented Captain Planet. So, where did Margaret Thatcher stand in all this? Well, Thatcher, I think, went through 3 distinct phases. In the early 1980s, she was quite a slow adopter. It was only really when acid rain started to become a diplomatic issue and when it looked like it was going to hurt diplomatic relations with NATO allies that she began to really take an interest. But in her second phase, in the late 1980s, she became, as we've heard, a global leader. So in 1988, she gave a landmark speech to the Royal Society. She said, "We have begun a massive experiment with the system of life on this planet itself." She took the same message to the UN General Assembly in 1989. In 1990, she told the World Climate Conference, "We have been playing with the conditions of life. We have treated the air and the oceans like a dustbin, risking the biological balance on which human life depends." I'm fighting very hard not to do the Thatcher voice. At the 1988 Conservative Party conference, she said that it was the Conservatives who were the true friends of the earth. And she made this very striking claim: the core of Tory philosophy and the case for protecting the environment are the same. No generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease. So, fine words here, and those words were backed by action. There was the London Conference in 1989 on saving the ozone layer. There was the Hadley Centre for Climate Change. There were new targets on unleaded petrol, CFCs and carbon emissions. The document on the right there is the front of a report that Margaret Thatcher commissioned from the Cabinet Office, asking how every department of government could prepare for climate change over the coming decades. It's 93 pages long, and on every page there are Thatcher's underlinings and annotations and markings. So that was phase 2. Unfortunately, there was then a third phase in which Thatcher became more hostile to environmentalism, partly as she was spending more time in the United States and in kind of Republican political networks. She grew increasingly suspicious of international institutions. She began to see environmentalism as a mask for socialism. In her book Statecraft, she talks about environmentalists as doomsters, which is, of course, a very Boris Johnson word. Doomsters who wanted to dismantle capitalism. She accused them of using climate action as a marvellous excuse for worldwide supranational socialism. She called the Kyoto Agreement an anti-growth, anti-capitalist, anti-American project, which no American leader alert to his country's national interests could have supported. So Margaret Thatcher is a kind of one-person case study into some of the pressures pulling conservatism forwards and backwards on this issue. So I just want to pull out a few of those. So firstly, it clearly mattered that Margaret Thatcher was a scientist. She was famously more proud of being the first Prime Minister with a science degree than of being the first Prime Minister who was a woman. She was also enormously proud that it was the British Antarctic Survey that had exposed the hole in the ozone layer. she took very great pains to ensure that the Hadley Centre was properly financed. So in that sense, this was a conservatism that embraced science and took great pride in it. And that might be more of a challenge if the Conservative Party becomes more suspicious of universities and of expertise. She also illustrates some of the challenges of working internationally. On the one hand, it was really important to Margaret Thatcher that things like action against leaded petrol happened at a European level, because that meant that Britain wasn't putting itself at a competitive disadvantage. That if Britain was going to spend more on leading petrol, then so were the Germans and so were the French. But that same internationalism also made her very suspicious of climate action. It encouraged her, as we've seen, to see it as an attack on British sovereignty by a power-hungry EU. And that tension between working internationally so that China and other big polluters also pay, and the defence of sovereignty, I think remains a real challenge for the Conservative Party today. It also mattered that there was serious electoral pressure. The Green Party won 2.3 million votes in the European elections in 1989. It's not an accident that both the big two parties start talking up green policy at more or less exactly that moment. It's less clear, I think, which way the electoral pressures are pointing today. But if we want any of our major parties to take climate policy seriously, I think there needs to be a sense that there are electoral rewards to embracing it and costs to dumping it. As we know, Margaret Thatcher was very keen on national defence. And she talked about climate action as a form of security. She said, spending on the environment is like spending on defence. If you do not do it in time, it may be too late. And that national security argument remains very strong today. But of course, it can also be used by advocates of fossil fuels to argue for energy independence and energy security. So there's a battle that needs to be won for climate action as a form of national defence. Perhaps a final point from the Thatcher experience. Leadership is important, but it's not enough. Margaret Thatcher went from scepticism to enthusiasm to scepticism. David Cameron famously went from hugging huskies to talking about cutting the green crap. Boris Johnson, I think, was quite environmentally minded in a way that perhaps constrained what right-wing newspapers were willing to say about net zero, in a way that his two successors seem to have been a little bit less sympathetic. So it's crucial to embed climate policy across and down major political parties so that they can survive changes of leader or changing tides within the party. And in that respect, I think what the Conservative Environment Network is trying to do is really important. And whatever party we belong to, I suspect we all have a stake in its success. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much. We've got an enormous amount to think about as we head into the drinks reception. Please do join us for a drink and a snack and to continue the conversation. It's been very good having you all here this evening, but before we stampede to the drinks, please can we thank our panel for this evening.